what if the urge to go to war isn't just, a political choice?
Right, like something negotiated in a boardroom.
Exactly. What if it's actually a biological contagion? Like, what if the peace treaties we sign or the borders we draw,
The handshakes for the camera.
the handshakes, what if all of that is actually useless because the trauma of the last war has already been like hard-coded into the biological expression of the next generation?
It's a heavy question, and it really challenges everything we think we know about geopolitics.
It really does. So welcome to the deep dive. You listening right now, we're so glad you're here because today we are taking a highly focused, almost microscopic look at a single paragraph.
Just one paragraph from a really fascinating document.
Yeah, it's from the Peaceful World Movement Manifesto, specifically version 1.0.
Which is a remarkable piece of literature because it doesn't just offer, some vague wish for world peace.
Right.
It literally attempts to engineer a blueprint for a peaceful civilization. But as you said, we're not doing the whole thing today.
No, definitely not. We are zooming in entirely on point 12.
Which is titled The Culture of Reconciliation and Trauma-Informedness.
That's it. It's just a handful of sentences. But our mission for this deep dive is to completely, deconstruct this text because the concepts packed into this one paragraph, I mean, they have the power to entirely reframe how humanity handles the aftermath of conflict.
It really shifts the entire paradigm. It moves us from political negotiation into actual biological and psychological intervention.
Okay, let's unpack this. The very first line of this paragraph, it just comes out swinging. The text states, stopping the war is half the battle. Memory needs to be healed.
Just sit with that for a second.
Yeah, you listening, consider what that actually means. Stopping the physical violence, the thing we pour billions of dollars into.
And countless diplomatic hours.
Exactly. The text says that's only 50% of the job.
It completely upends the traditional finish line. I mean, we are culturally conditioned to view the ceasefire as the ultimate goal, right?
Oh, absolutely. The documents are signed on some giant mahogany table.
The cameras flash, the politicians shake hands, and the world just sort of collectively exhales and believes the crisis is resolved.
But this text is calmly pointing out that, well, we've completely misidentified the finish line. That handshake is barely the halfway mark.
Right, because our conventional view of peace is essentially just the absence of visible fire.
Yeah, the shooting stops, the troops retreat, and we just slap the label peace on it.
But to understand why the text claims this is only half the battle, we have to look at how it defines the invisible wreckage left behind.
Which is so crucial. The text explicitly states that unprocessed trauma acts as the direct fuel for future wars.
I want to focus intensely on that specific word for a second. Fuel.
It's a strong word choice.
It really is. The authors aren't using, a poetic metaphor here. They aren't suggesting that trauma is just a tragic byproduct of conflict or some, unfortunate passive residue.
Right, like dust settling after an earthquake.
Exactly. By defining unprocessed trauma as fuel, they are categorizing it as highly combustible active material. It is just waiting for an ignition source.
So let's get granular on what unprocessed trauma actually means in this macro context. Because we're not talking about a generalized sense of sadness.
No, not at all. We are talking about the collective psychological state of a population that has just survived mass terror.
And is then immediately told by the international community to just, go back to normal because the treaties are signed.
Which is absurd when you really think about it. The failure to process that trauma is exactly where the danger lies.
Because unprocessed trauma on a societal level is, it's an unresolved existential wound.
Yes, it's the grief that wasn't allowed to be spoken because the infrastructure for mourning just doesn't exist anymore.
It's the sheer terror that remains trapped in the nervous systems of millions of citizens.
And when that trauma hasn't been acknowledged or validated and actively treated, it ferments.
It mutates.
Exactly. It mutates into deep-seated mistrust, hypervigilance, and this collective narrative of victimhood that inevitably demands vindication. That is the combustible material. That is the fuel.
So if we look at the implications of this, the text is essentially arguing that any peace treaty that doesn't explicitly address the psychological state of the population.
Which is fundamentally flawed.
Yeah, it's just leaving vast tanks of gasoline lying around in the open.
That is the exact diagnostic reality the manifesto is exposing. We usually think of memory as a passive archive, like a library of historical events that we just look back on.
But the text demands we treat memory as an active living entity. It says memory requires healing,
which implies medical-level intervention.
Right, not just historical archiving.
What's fascinating here is the distinction they're drawing between history and memory.
Oh, break that down for us.
Well, history is the static record of what happened. Dates, locations, casualty numbers. But memory is the living, breathing, emotional software that dictates how a population reacts to the present.
Okay, wow. So if you don't heal the living memory, you don't actually have peace.
You just have a heavily armed pause. You have an interwar period.
Because a spark is always going to happen.
Yeah, always.
In any geopolitical landscape, you're going to have an economic downturn or a dispute over a border or, a charismatic demagogue looking to consolidate power.
And if the societal memory is completely unhealed and acting as fuel, the demagogue doesn't even need to manufacture a crisis.
They just strike a match.
Exactly. The unhealed memory does the rest of the work for them.
Which is why the text insists that stopping the shooting is only half the job. Without the healing of memory, the ceasefire is just a structural illusion.
It is a ticking clock. It's just a countdown until the trauma finds a way to express itself as violence once again.
But what's wild is that the Manifesto doesn't just leave this concept in the realm of psychology or political science.
No, it goes much deeper.
It pushes the boundaries straight into hardcore physical biology. And this brings us to, honestly, the most startling claim in the text.
The epigenetic component.
Yes. It identifies transgenerational trauma fixed at the epigenetic level as the primary mechanism for this fuel.
And that is a highly specific, very deliberate use of advanced biological terminology.
To fully grasp the weight of this paragraph, we really have to explore the mechanics of epigenetics and how it actually applies to mass conflict.
So, assuming most of our listeners are familiar with the basic concept of DNA.
Right, the genetic blueprint we inherit from our parents.
Exactly. We need to clarify that epigenetics isn't about the DNA sequence itself mutating.
Okay, so we aren't talking about, radiation altering the base pairs of the genome.
Correct. The sequence of your DNA, the actual nucleotide letters, those remain exactly the same. Epigenetics is the study of how behaviors and environments cause changes that affect the expression of those genes.
Ah, expression.
Yes. It is about which genes are turned on and which are turned off.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If we look at the biochemical mechanism, like DNA methylation.
Right, where methyl groups attach to the DNA molecule.
Yeah, and they physically prevent certain genes from being read. When you look at that, we start to see how trauma literally alters the organism.
I like to use an analogy for this. Think of your DNA as a massive, intricate instruction manual for building and running your body.
Okay, I'm with you.
The words in the manual never change. But extreme environmental stress, like the sheer terror, starvation, and violence of a war zone, that stress acts as a biochemical highlighter and a black marker.
Wow.
To survive the trauma, the human body has to adapt drastically. So it upregulates stress hormones, it hardwires the nervous system for hypervigilance, it alters immune responses.
So it essentially highlights the paragraphs in the manual that scream, danger.
And crosses out the paragraphs that say, relax and connect with others.
Yes. It's like downloading a hyper-defensive software patch. The organism updates its operating system to survive a massive environmental virus, which in this case is the war.
That's a great way to frame it. But here is the terrifying part that the text is highlighting. Those epigenetic changes, that highlighted and redacted version of the instruction manual. Yeah, that specific version can be passed down through the germline to the next generation.
Which is it's staggering. That is the biological reality of transgenerational trauma.
The text is making a profound assertion here. War is not merely a political event. It is a biological contagion.
The fear, the hyperreactivity, the propensity for extreme stress responses, these are physically inherited by children who were never even born when the bombs were falling.
So you have an entire generation of children who inherit this highly sensitive, highly defensive software patch from their parents.
But the problem is, these kids are running wartime software in a peacetime environment.
Exactly. There is no active threat. Right. But their internal biological alarms are still screaming that they are under attack.
If we connect this back to the bigger picture, the implications for peace building are just staggering. You have a population biologically predisposed to view the world through a lens of existential threat.
They are structurally adapted to perceive a neighboring group not as potential partners, but as absolute predators.
Which makes that diplomatic handshake on the mahogany table seem almost absurdly inadequate, doesn't it?
It's worse than inadequate. It's naive. You are asking a population to simply ignore their own biological imperative just because someone signed a piece of paper.
If this transgenerational mechanism is dictating the emotional baseline of a defeated or traumatized nation, it takes virtually no political manipulation to trigger a new war.
Because the biological fuel is already primed in their cellular structure?
It creates a massive friction point.
Yeah.
The text basically forces us to acknowledge that we are often fighting the ghosts of our grandparents.
And those ghosts are living in our gene expression. The trauma is literally fixed, as the manifesto states, at the epigenetic level.
But, realizing that trauma is a biological contagion creates kind of an existential crisis.
How so?
Well, if human beings are structurally adapting to the trauma of war and then passing that biological hypervigilance down to their children, aren't we just trapped in a deterministic loop? I mean, it sounds like an inescapable biological curse where every war just automatically breeds the physiological fuel for the next one.
It would be a curse if biology were entirely static.
Right.
But the manifesto does not present this as a fatalistic doom loop. It diagnoses the biological reality of the fuel in order to prescribe a highly specific, engineered methodology to neutralize it.
Okay, so what's the pivot?
The text pivots immediately to the solution. It says, we are implementing approaches of trauma-informed peace building. We apply the salutogenic approach, focusing on the sources of social health and the possibilities of post-traumatic growth.
Let's break down the mechanics of this solution, starting with the salutogenic approach, because that is not a common term in everyday geopolitical discourse.
It isn't, but it is the crucial pivot point of this entire philosophy. To understand salutogenesis, we really have to contrast it with the model that governs almost the entirety of our current global systems.
Which is?
The pathogenic model.
Pathogenesis, meaning the origin of disease.
Exactly the translation. The pathogenic approach studies what causes disease, what causes systems to break down, what causes failure.
Right, like finding the root cause of an illness.
Yes. And when applied to conflict resolution, a pathogenic approach looks at a war-torn region and studies the pathology of the violence.
So it asks things like, what caused this society to break down? Who fired the first shot? What are the economic drivers of the hatred?
Precisely. It focuses entirely on the disease of the conflict.
Which, I mean, that seems logical on the surface. If something is broken, you study the break to fix it. If you have an infection, a doctor uses a pathogenic model to find the bacteria and eradicate it.
It is absolutely logical for acute triage. But as the medical sociologist Aaron Antonovsky, who developed the concept of salutogenesis, as he pointed out, studying disease only teaches you about disease.
Interesting.
It tells you absolutely nothing about the origins of health. If you only study why people go to war, you never actually learn the mechanics of how people sustain peace under pressure.
Oh, wow. So salutogenesis, the origin of health, flips the inquiry entirely.
Completely. A salutogenic approach to peace building enters a traumatized post-conflict society and asks a radically different set of questions.
What kind of questions?
Instead of obsessing over the pathology of the hatred, it asks, even in the midst of this horrific violence, what were the factors that kept some communities resilient?
Ah, looking for the bright spots.
Right. Where are the sources of social health connection and mutual aid? What allows certain individuals to maintain empathy despite the trauma?
So instead of acting like a surgeon trying to cut out a tumor of violence, trauma-informed peace building acts more like an immunologist.
That's a perfect analogy.
It tries to map the social immune system of the population and actively cultivate the healthy tissue.
That is the exact mechanism. You cannot just eradicate the disease of war. You have to actively engineer the conditions for health. But this requires deep structural work.
I have to challenge the feasibility of this, though.
Go ahead.
If a society is deeply infected with the transgenerational epigenetic trauma we just discussed.
Right, the fuel.
Yeah, the biological fuel is actively pumping through the population, doesn't focusing on social health, risk becoming a form of toxic positivity.
How do you mean?
Like, if a regime has committed atrocities, coming in and saying, hey, let's focus on the healthy parts of our society, feels like it could easily be weaponized to sweep the horror under the rug. It sounds dangerously close to ignoring the trauma.
That is the exact trap that superficial peace building falls into, and it is why the manifesto intrinsically links the salutogenic approach to the concept of post-traumatic growth.
Okay, so they anticipate that trap.
Yes. The text is not advocating for ignoring the trauma. It explicitly says trauma-informed. That means you place the trauma at the very center of your strategy, but you change the objective of the intervention.
How does post-traumatic growth differ from standard resilience? Usually we tell traumatized populations to bounce back. We want them to return to the state they were in before the war started.
But think about that. The state they were in before the war started is the exact state that produced the war. Bouncing back is a failure of structural evolution. Post-traumatic growth is the phenomenon where an organism or a society processes a massive psychological earthquake and reorganizes itself into a fundamentally stronger, more complex, and more empathetic entity.
Because of the trauma, not in spite of it.
Exactly, because of it.
Let's try to ground this in a physical mechanism. Like, think of a broken bone.
Okay.
If you suffer a severe fracture, a massive trauma to the skeletal system, and you do nothing, the bone heals deformed.
Yes. It limits your mobility, it creates chronic pain, and it leaves the structural integrity compromised.
And that is a society with unprocessed trauma.
The epigenetic fuel continues to burn as chronic pain.
But if that fracture is subjected to medical intervention, if it is set properly by a physician, which represents the trauma-informed approach, the bone doesn't just return to its previous state.
Right.
The physiological response to the break actually deposits denser, thicker calcium at the exact site of the fracture.
Which is incredible.
Yeah, the place where the bone was shattered literally becomes the strongest point in the entire skeletal structure.
That is the perfect biological translation of post-traumatic growth. And the Manifesto is arguing that we can engineer this exact process on a macro-societal level.
Okay.
If we apply trauma-informed salutogenic peace building, we can use the shattered pieces of a post-war society to build a new civic infrastructure that is highly resistant to the demagoguery that caused the break in the first place.
But realizing that trauma can be transformed into growth brings us face to face with a massive ethical dilemma.
Which is accountability.
Yes. To set that societal bone, to initiate that growth, you eventually have to deal with the people who wielded the hammer. You have to address justice.
And this is where the text demands a complete overhaul of our justice systems.
Because how do you hold war criminals accountable without accidentally infecting the next generation with the exact same epigenetic trauma?
That friction point forces us to completely rethink the mechanics of justice. The Manifesto states that we must transition from punitive justice to restorative and transitional justice and observe the principles of jus post bellum.
Let's tackle punitive justice first, because this is the model almost every modern society operates on.
It is the default setting.
And it's incredibly straightforward. Punitive justice asks what law was broken, who broke it, and what is the proportional amount of suffering we must inflict upon the offender to balance the scales.
It is an ancient, deeply embedded mechanism. When a population is victimized by war, the primal evolutionary response is a demand for retribution.
Naturally, the victims want the aggressors to suffer the exact humiliation and pain that they endured.
And frankly, it feels morally correct in the moment.
It totally does. The desire to crush the leadership of the opposing side, to bankrupt their economy through reparations, to publicly humiliate them.
It feels like the only rational response to atrocities.
But the text is challenging that rationality.
It is. It asks us to look at the long-term biological and societal output of that model. If you apply a strictly punitive model to a defeated nation, what are you mechanically producing?
You are manufacturing the exact trauma fuel we've been talking about.
Precisely. Let's look at it through the lens of antibiotic resistance.
Oh, I like this.
If you view the aggressor nation as a bacterial infection, punitive justice acts as a massive aggressive dose of a broad-spectrum antibiotic.
Okay, so it comes in and utterly devastates the bacteria. You crush the military, you imprison the leaders, you inflict heavy economic penalties.
But antibiotics rarely kill 100% of the bacteria.
Right. There are always survivors.
Exactly. And the bacteria that survive that massive aggressive attack don't just go back to normal.
No, they mutate.
Yes. The environmental pressure of that antibiotic forces them to mutate. They adapt to the harsh environment. And because you focused entirely on devastation rather than restoring the health of the host environment.
They multiply and return as a superbug.
Yes. They return exponentially more resistant, more aggressive, and harder to defeat.
That is a chilling way to look at history. By inflicting massive punitive suffering on a defeated population, you might satisfy the immediate urge for revenge, but you are systematically subjecting the children of that defeated nation to the environmental stress that triggers the epigenetic trauma response.
You are. They grow up in the ruins of the antibiotic strike, absorbing the humiliation and poverty of their parents.
And a generation later, they mutate into a radicalized superbug, perfectly primed to follow a leader who promises to restore their dignity through violence.
This is exactly why the Manifesto demands a transition to restorative and transitional justice. It recognizes that punitive justice, on a macro-societal scale, is structurally incapable of ending the cycle of violence.
It only pauses the cycle while the defeated side mutates.
Correct.
So how does restorative justice actually work in the aftermath of a war? Because my immediate pushback, and I'm sure the listener is thinking this too, is that it sounds alarmingly like impunity.
It's a common fear.
If a regime actively commits mass murder, replacing punitive prison sentences with a restorative approach feels grotesquely inadequate to the victims. How does the Manifesto prevent this from just being a free pass for atrocities?
This is perhaps the most difficult conceptual leap for post-conflict societies to make, but we have to be clear. Restorative justice is not forgiveness, and it is certainly not impunity.
Okay, so what is it?
It fundamentally changes the primary questions justice asks. Instead of asking, what law was broken and how do we punish the offender?
Right.
It asks, who is harmed and what are the specific obligations required to repair that harm?
So what does that repair actually look like mechanically? Because you can't unbomb a city. You can't bring back the dead.
No, you cannot.
You know.
But you can shift the focus of the justice system away from the state inflicting pain on the offender and toward the offender being forced to materially and psychologically repair the victim's community.
How does that play out?
In practice, restorative justice often involves intense, highly structured truth-telling mechanisms. The perpetrators are brought face-to-face with the victims, but the goal isn't just a confession for a court record.
It's the forced confrontation with the human reality of their actions.
Yes. The offender has to listen to the agonizing reality of the pain they caused without the sterile protection of a traditional courtroom proceeding.
So it removes the glory, the ideology, and the state-sanctioned justification for the violence.
Exactly. It forces the perpetrator to look at the shattered human lives they created. And then the accountability takes the form of forced repair.
Like physically rebuilding.
Yes, perpetrators physically rebuilding the infrastructure they destroyed, or the wealth of the aggressor class being systematically dismantled to fund the long-term salutogenic recovery of the victimized communities.
It strips away the seesaw dynamic.
Yeah.
Punitive justice is just two sides taking turns pushing each other into the dirt.
A perfect image.
Restorative justice is, like, dismantling the seesaw entirely to build a new foundation. But getting a society to agree to dismantle that seesaw while they are still bleeding, I mean, that requires an incredibly delicate architecture.
Which is the domain of transitional justice. The Manifesto pairs these two concepts very deliberately.
What's the distinction?
Transitional justice refers to the specific, temporary institutional mechanisms a society uses to bridge the gap between a state of massive human rights abuses and a stable, trauma-informed democracy.
So it's the transitional phase.
Yes, it encompasses the truth commissions, the rapid institutional reforms required to purge corrupt officials so that the abuses physically cannot happen again, and the complex reparations programs.
It is the active, messy engineering of the bridge out of the cycle.
Exactly. And the text adds one more layer to this structural redesign of justice. It states that we must observe the principles of jus post bellum.
Justice after war.
Yes. This is a concept that has been historically heavily overshadowed.
Right, because for centuries, philosophers and legal scholars focus mostly on jus ad bellum, the ethical justifications for going to war.
In jus in bello, the ethical rules of conduct during the war, like the prohibition against targeting civilian infrastructure.
But historically, once the war was won, the ethical frameworks just sort of evaporated.
They completely disappeared. The victor essentially operated on the principle that they could dictate whatever terms they wanted because they held the monopoly on force.
The Manifesto revives and demands strict adherence to jus post bellum. This framework argues that the victor has profound, binding ethical obligations to the defeated society.
You do not gain the right to endless exploitation just because you won.
Right. Jus post bellum dictates that the victor must assist in rebuilding the society they helped shatter.
They must establish legitimate, trauma-informed security forces. They must ensure the protection of minority populations in the newly drawn borders.
And crucially, they must relinquish control and leave once the society reaches a threshold of stability.
It's the ultimate rejection of the spoils of war mentality.
It is an ethical mandate that you cannot just break a country, extract its resources under the guise of punitive reparations, and walk away.
You have a duty to restore the salutogenic health of the environment. Otherwise,
You were just breeding the superbud for the next generation.
exactly. It requires a level of geopolitical discipline that human history has rarely, if ever, witnessed. And this profound shift in how we handle accountability and repair directly dictates the final concept in point 12.
Which is arguably the most culturally deeply rooted concept of all. How a society chooses to permanently record the events of the trauma.
Because even if you implement restorative justice, and even if you rebuild the institutions, human beings are fundamentally storytelling creatures.
We are. We cannot just sign the treaties and pretend the horrors never happened. We need to leave a mark.
We need monuments, holidays, and narratives to make sense of the loss.
And this brings us to the concluding mandate of the paragraph. We develop a memorial culture, so history teaches rather than avenges.
The authors draw a very hard, very bright line regarding the architecture of memory here. They acknowledge that a society must remember.
Because suppressing the historical record would be a pathogenic denial of the trauma.
Right, but they issue a severe warning about the purpose of that memory.
Teaches rather than avenges. Let's examine the avenging side of that equation, because if we look around the globe, it seems like the vast majority of our historical architecture is built specifically to avenge.
An avenging memorial culture is actively pathogenic. It is designed to keep the epigenetic trauma hot.
Wow.
It glorifies the victims not by exploring their human complexity, but by violently demonizing the enemy.
We see this in the literal architecture of monuments all the time.
We do.
Massive, intimidating bronze statues of generals on horseback with swords drawn, positioned to stare aggressively toward the borders of rival nations.
We see it in national holidays that do not mourn the tragic loss of human potential, but instead celebrate military dominance and the crushing of the other.
We also see it in the educational infrastructure. Avenging memorial cultures produce history textbooks that portray their own nation as flawless, divinely ordained heroes,
while reducing the opposing side to subhuman monsters devoid of any rational motivation.
It essentially builds a cultural shrine to the trauma fuel.
That's exactly what it is. The sole purpose of interacting with that memorial culture is to trigger the biological alarm bells.
You visit the monument or you participate in the parade, and the intended outcome is to make you righteously angry about an atrocity that occurred a century before you were born.
It uses the memory of the dead as a weaponized tool to demand future blood,
which completely undermines any attempt at trauma-informed peace-building. You cannot apply a salutogenic approach if your public squares are filled with architecture designed to induce historical rage.
You just can't.
But I have to push back on the alternative here. So history teaches rather than avenges. How is this practically achieved without erasing the reality of the crime?
It's a very fine line.
Right? Like, if I am tasked with building a museum that documents the systematic massacre of my grandparents' generation, how do I design that experience so it doesn't inherently provoke a desire for revenge against the descendants of the perpetrators?
It's tough.
The line between teaching horror and inciting hatred seems dangerously thin.
This raises such an important question because it is the ultimate stress test of the entire manifesto. The difference lies in where the memorial directs the psychological focus of the observer.
Okay, unpack that.
An avenging memorial directs the focus outward toward the evil of the enemy. A teaching memorial directs the focus inward toward the staggering universal tragedy of the conflict itself.
Okay, so it shifts the narrative from look at what those monsters did to us, we must never trust them, to look at the catastrophic cost of war, we must never allow these conditions to arise again.
Yes. Consider the architectural philosophy behind something like the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C.
Oh, that's a brilliant example.
It is a profound, albeit imperfect, example of a shift toward a teaching memorial. It strips away the traditional glory of combat.
Right. It isn't a towering statue of a soldier vanquishing a foe.
It is a stark, reflective black wall, cut deeply into the earth like a scar, simply listing the chronological names of the dead.
It doesn't tell you how to feel about the politics of the war. It simply confronts you with the sheer, overwhelming volume of the human cost.
Exactly. When you look at that wall, it doesn't incite a desire to pick up a weapon and find an enemy. It induces a profound sense of grief.
It teaches the observer that the ultimate output of conflict is a devastating, permanent loss of human life.
An avenging memorial makes you want to fight. A teaching memorial makes you want to dismantle the machinery that creates the names on the wall.
It reminds me of how we deal with physical scars on our own bodies. Let's say you have a massive jagged scar on your arm from a time when a colleague handed you a dangerous, sharp tool the wrong way,
Okay.
and it slipped and tore your skin open. You carry that scar with you every day. Now, you have two choices in how you interact with that memory. You can look at that scar every morning, and you can use it to actively stoke your hatred for the colleague who handed you the tool.
You can use the visual reminder of the pain to justify plotting your revenge.
Exactly, telling yourself, I will never forget what they did to me, and one day I will make them pay. That is an avenging memory. The scar is just a mechanism to keep the rage alive.
Yes, and structurally, that rage keeps your cortisol levels high. It keeps your biological systems primed for conflict.
Right. But the alternative is that you look at the exact same scar, you acknowledge the intense pain of the original event, but you shift the purpose of the memory.
You let it teach you.
You let the scar teach you. Sharp tools are inherently dangerous. I must be incredibly disciplined when handling them, and I must design better safety protocols in my workshop so that no one, not even the person who cut me, ever has to experience this specific pain again. That is a teaching memory.
And that is the exact cognitive shift the Manifesto is demanding on a macro scale. We have to look at the collective historical scars of humanity, the battlefields, the camps, the ruined cities, and actively choose to let those scars teach us to dismantle the sharp tools of war.
Rather than using the scars as an ideological excuse to go stab the neighboring nation.
Because if the memorial culture teaches, the trauma is finally allowed to process.
The epigenetic alarm bells that have been ringing for generations can finally be quieted.
The fuel is safely neutralized.
It is the final, necessary step to permanently close the loop. Without a teaching memorial culture, even the best restorative justice and salutogenic policies will eventually be eroded by the slow, generational drip of avenging historical narratives.
It's all connected.
We've been dissecting this text for nearly an hour, and we have literally only covered the internal concepts of a single paragraph. Point 12.
It is a dense, masterfully engineered piece of sociological architecture.
Let's try to synthesize the sheer scale of the journey we just went on.
Good idea.
We started by dismantling the illusion of the ceasefire, the deeply unsettling realization that stopping the physical violence is only half the work.
Because the unhealed memory of the conflict acts as a volatile, combustible fuel.
From there, we traced the biological reality of that fuel. We explored how transgenerational trauma, fixed at the epigenetic level, operates like a corrupted software patch.
Meaning the hypervigilance and terror of war are literally inherited by the next generation, pre-programming them for future violence.
We then looked at the specific methodologies required to break that biological cycle. We unpacked the necessity of trauma-informed peace building and the critical shift to a salutogenic approach.
Mapping the societal immune system to engineer post-traumatic growth, rather than just endlessly analyzing the pathology of the conflict.
Which required us to fundamentally rebuild our systems of accountability. We discussed the dangers of punitive justice acting like a broad-spectrum antibiotic that breeds radicalized superbugs.
And the absolute necessity of transitioning to restorative and transitional justice, guided by the ethical rebuilding mandates of Just Post Bellum.
And finally, we arrived at the physical and cultural architecture of how we remember. The strict mandate to design our memorial culture so that our monuments, our textbooks, and our holidays teach the devastating cost of the sharp tools.
Rather than demanding we use those tools again to avenge the past.
It is an incredibly cohesive, start-to-finish blueprint for deactivating the machinery of war.
What this paragraph ultimately proves is that peace is not a passive condition. We often casually define peace as just sitting around not doing anything violent.
Right.
But this text reveals that true, lasting peace is a highly active, rigorously maintained, and deeply engineered state.
It requires medical-level psychological intervention on a mass scale.
Structural overhauls of justice, and a disciplined, daily refusal to give in to our base evolutionary instincts for retribution.
And that leads me to a final thought I want to leave with you, the listener, today.
I'm curious where you're going with this.
Well, we've spent this entire deep dive exploring grand geopolitical concepts. We've talked about international treaties, mass societal trauma, and global justice systems.
Huge macro ideas.
But if this transgenerational mechanism dictates the fate of whole nations, it is worth asking how it operates in our own microcultures.
The fractal nature of these concepts is what makes them so universally applicable.
Exactly. Think about the architecture of your own mind. Think about the conflicts of your personal history, the severe breakups, the deep professional betrayals, the familial arguments that left a lasting scar.
We all have them.
When you interact with those memories, what is their function? Do you apply a salutogenic approach?
Do you use the memory of that betrayal to teach yourself how to set better boundaries, how to communicate with more precision, or how to identify healthier environments?
Or do you build avenging monuments in your own head?
Ow.
Do you replay the arguments in the shower just to get your heart rate up and feel the rage all over again?
Most people do.
Do you use the memory of the person who hurt you solely to justify your current bitterness? If we don't apply these trauma-informed principles to our own personal conflicts, if we constantly tend to the shrines of our own victimhood, are we just storing up fuel for our own private wars?
Because eventually that fuel is going to catch a spark.
And you will be the one burning.
If we ever hope to achieve a culture of reconciliation on a global macro scale, it really has to begin with the rigorous discipline of how we process the trauma in our own individual memories.
Heal the memory, neutralize the fuel. Thank you so much for joining us on this intense, highly focused deep dive into the source material.
It was a dense journey.
It was. But we hope you're walking away with a completely new mechanical understanding of what it actually takes to build lasting peace. Take care of yourselves and pay attention to what your memory is teaching you.